Okay, so we'll pray in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Mighty God, we ask you to reveal your commandments to us, so that way we might know your will, that we might obey it, that we might understand what you teach us that is for our happiness, for our holiness. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. So one of the things, I don't know that I said this actually early on, but the commandments are all, you might say they're guideposts that, or guardrails that show us how we should be focused or what direction we should be going in. And they help really for us to persevere in happiness, truly, because that keeps us on the right path. If we live our lives in union with God, that actually does make for happiness. So that's, sometimes we talk about all the things, oh, you can't do this and you can't do that, but it's really for our benefit. So we actually profit very much from these things. So we'll continue on kind of with where we left off last time. We were partway into the sixth commandment. So do we have any young children here? Last week we had some young children. That's okay. So okay, that means I can get really serious about the sixth commandment now. So okay, so we don't have to be careful that sometimes on Sundays, when priests are preaching, we're always in a mixed crowd because you always have a mix of all sorts of people, including children. So you always have to be a little mindful of that. But when you're just with adults, then that restriction is not present. But okay. One of the things that we talked about before, so just to remind you of kind of where we went last time in talking about the sixth commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery. We started with some of the things about the way that God made us. And so that has to do with just creation, being made in the image of God, being male and female, and that's what led to a lot of the observations we had. So we talked about chastity. What does it mean to live out chastely our lives, which is something that everyone is called to do according to their state of life. So we spent some time with that. And also the challenge of really growing in chastity, which really is a lifelong task and something that we always have to work toward. So some of the things that and this was before we got really into the section on marriage. So we're going to actually kind of transition more into the idea specifically of the vocation of marriage as we talk about marriage, and then also some of the sins that would be against the sixth commandment that would be more in the context of marriage. But in general, before we get into specifically the idea of marriage, some of the things we talked about previously would be ways of misusing our sexual powers, which are not necessarily directly connected to marriage. That had to do with the idea of lust, the idea of masturbation, which is intrinsically disordered. Something that we mentioned, that these things are always selfish, so they always become selfish as opposed to the selfless, which we'll talk about in a little bit about marriage, the idea of a selfless giving of oneself to one's spouse, and that's always important. Fornication would be sexual intercourse outside of marriage. Pornography in particular, we talked about the damage that does really to everyone. Everyone involved is harmed by that. Prostitution in particular defiles a person, whose body, all of our bodies, are to be a temple of the Holy Spirit, and so that in particular, that's a misuse of really something that is quite sacred. And then especially rape, we talked about the grave damage that can do. People don't have to think very hard about just how damaging that is, and obviously that's something that's gravely harmful, so that would be a serious problem. I mentioned, as we were just finishing last time, that I mentioned that we would get into the area of homosexuality. I didn't want to get into it and with so little time left. So we'll talk about that a little bit. This is one of the more difficult issues that's probably to discuss today, because we live in a society that is much more increasingly not only tolerated or encouraged or approved of homosexuality, so it makes it very sensitive. It's don't post about something on social media, you'll get in all sorts of trouble. So that's so what does the church say about homosexuality? The homosexual acts themselves are contrary to the moral law, because sexuality itself is meant to draw together the husband and wife. We'll talk about that in a little bit when I mention marriage. But it's also open to the transmission of life, and that can occur naturally with a husband and a wife, between a man and a woman united in marriage, and then capable of bringing new life into the world. And so that becomes the purpose for sexuality. Homosexual acts themselves are not, by definition, are not open to the transmission of life. And so that's one of the things that makes them also in particular selfish rather than that selfless. I know that's a difficult message. I don't think there'd be a lot of people who would disagree with that, I think, in our society. So I'm kind of just sort of stating what the Catechism states, but knowing that sometimes I'll use the phrase that the gospel that the world proclaims, sometimes I'll say that in homilies, and this is one where you might say the gospel the world proclaims is different from the gospel that's proclaimed by the church or the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so in the worldly point of view, the gospel message there, and I have to say that this is actually a really difficult one to overcome, because I think it's very convincing for a lot of people, especially a lot of young people, is the world's gospel on this point is, if it feels good, then do it. That would be the world's point of view. And the language of the gospel, or the logic that is presented by the gospel, or the logic of God in creating us the way that we are, is a little more complicated. And that's where it gets into the notion of how we were made, that we were made with a body, and that we are body and soul meant, in fact, to love the Lord. We were not meant just merely for the satisfaction of hedonic pleasure or for hedonism. That is actually, I think, in truth, really a very empty kind of life, to live just merely for pleasure. So there's got to be something more than that. There's got to be something that transcends that. And this is where I think there's really a great challenge that's given to us to really see the sexual powers as a profound gift that we need to use very carefully, precisely because they're so powerful, but that they also require a certain amount of discipline and self-sacrifice. And this also is another message not very popular in the world today. So I don't think the world wants to hear that either. So we'd rather just kind of be told that we can satisfy our desires however we wish. And so to say that we actually do have to discipline ourselves, and that we're better off for doing that, is, I think, true, but kind of a little hard to sell. It's especially a little hard to explain and make really clear. But one of the things that I think happens, and I'll make this observation because I think in our society you can kind of just say generally that what I'm about to say is broadly speaking true, is that we have a society today where there is more sex than ever, and we have a society that is extremely unhappy, and it's filled with a tremendous amount of anxiety. And so if you can have all the sex you want, but you're not happy, then that tells me, then that means that people know somehow deep down that something's not right. So there's something that's something that is not, a good that is not fulfilled simply because a person satisfies their desires and pleasures. But there's something that I think is even more satisfying when we unite ourselves to God and when we make sacrifices for one another. And that's also an important part. That's going to be an important part of marriage, which I'll talk about just in a moment. There's also, an observation.
Yeah. Question about homosexuality in the Bible. What would you say to someone who says that, so you have Lot and the angels, right?
Mm-hmm.
Townspeople come, and the way I've read it is that they want to know the men.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say to someone who says that the sin of Sodom is unhospitality?
Mm-hmm. So the question, just to repeat it for the recording, is so what do you say if you're asked about the question of homosexuality in the Old Testament, and in particular the story of Sodom and Gomorrah? So there's the time at which Lot goes to Sodom. It's interesting that Lot and Abram at the time. They decide that they have to part ways because their cattle grazing, there's not enough land. So they said, let's separate so we can each spread out and have our space. So Abram says to Lot, you choose. And Lot chose Sodom because at the time it was so beautiful. It was so it was such a fertile looking area. Of course, then fire and brimstone. So okay, well that changes a little bit. But at the time, Lot was choosing what looked to be the best. And maybe this is actually one of the things I would say about the idea of satisfying our desires, is that sometimes we think that, well, this looks like what's going to make me the most happy. in the end, it didn't work out that way. So he chose what he thought was going to make him the most happy, but in the end, Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed in the story of Genesis. And therein is perhaps a little bit of a lesson for us too, is that sometimes it's not always in our best interest to choose the thing that we think is going to give us the greatest amount of pleasure. Sometimes just simply satisfying pleasure just wantonly actually leaves us less fulfilled. And I think there's a truth in there. There's something that, and maybe everyone can kind of think of some individual experiences. I don't mean just in terms of sex, but in other areas too. For example, a person who loves to eat delicious foods, and if you leave that to be satisfied as much as you want all the time, anytime you want, well, there's going to be a consequence to that. So say, oh, well, I look at all the good food, all the delicious food I get to eat, so that's going to make me the most happy. Not if a person gains an immense amount of weight, then they're unhappy. So they got all the pleasure they wanted, but it led to unhappiness. There's a truism in there, and I think we see it in many, many different ways. But as the story goes, so Lot goes into Sodom, and so the tendency there is where the word sodomy comes from when it's referring to some homosexual acts. It's related to the fact that there were a group of people that came to Lot's door because they saw that Lot had welcomed some visitors there, and they bang on the door. Now here I'm just quoting Genesis when it says that they bang on the door and they say, bring out your visitors because we want to have our way with them. Now, I don't think the implication there is that they wanted to, they wanted to gratify their desires, and that's pretty clear in the text. And Lot says these visitors, who happened to be angels, but they didn't know that at the time, so they just thought that they were men, but they were actually angels in the appearance of men. Then Lot said, well, no, these are my guests; they're under my protection. I'll make you a deal. Here are my daughters. I'll bring my daughters out. You can have them. So he's like, and it's a little bit of a crazy story. But he's ready to offer his daughter. Here, you can do what you want with them, but these men are my guests, and so they're under my protection. So for their sake, I can't bring them out. And they said, no, we don't want your daughters. We want the men who are there. So that's the story from Genesis, I think chapter 19, if I remember correctly. So the story itself, I think it'd be pretty hard to read it any other way. It was obvious that they were looking for sexual conquest, and that it was people of the same sex. So that would be an Old Testament passage. But then there are lots of New Testament passages where St. Paul is certainly very clear about this. So you'll hear different debates, but the scripture is pretty unambiguous about this. The other thing that I think is important to say is that the Catechism is also extremely sensitive and pastoral on this, just as for example, and I said this a little bit last time, that when it comes to self-pleasure or to masturbation, the Catechism was specific in identifying factors that could mitigate culpability, because this sometimes can be a very difficult thing. Not everyone is affected equally, but sometimes it can happen that this can be a very difficult sin for some people, especially young men, to overcome. And in that sense, the Catechism is very quick to say that there are things that can impair a person's ability to really embrace the virtue of chastity in this regard, because of a person's affected maturity or the idea of long-standing habit. These are some of the things I mentioned last time. Even the social factors, and this is one where I would say the presence of pornography today is one of those extraordinarily harmful realities present today that I think makes it very difficult sometimes for some people to be virtuous in this area. As well as just even the psychology of that. So sometimes people have their own, everyone is kind of dealing with whatever their own specific circumstances are, and that can sometimes make it very difficult. That's very pastoral, I think, of the Catechism. It's very sensitive to acknowledge that there are grave difficulties sometimes. And while the Catechism, and this is always important, and Jesus does the same thing, is he holds up the virtue, and we're unapologetic about the virtue. In other words, this is how it should be. This is what the ideal is. At the same time, we also recognize human weakness, and we're very patient with that. And I think both can be true. You can say this is how it should be, but we're also very patient with people who struggle. Just as Jesus is ready to forgive the woman caught in the act of adultery, and is ready to absolve her and dismiss her, but all at the same time is very clear when he's speaking about marriage, and he tells the Pharisees, for this reason a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife, and the two become one flesh. So if a man divorces his wife and marries another, he commits adultery against her. That's in the Sermon on the Mount. So Jesus is very clear in the teaching, but very kind in his interactions with people. The Catechism does the same thing when it comes to the area of homosexuality. So some people struggle with this as a deep-seated identity, and this is something that can be very difficult for some people to deal with. And so the Catechism says that a homosexual act is itself gravely immoral, but the idea of the homosexual tendency is something that some people may suffer with. And there's a great sense of kind of compassion or patience in sort of walking with people who are in that situation. They are called to chastity, which some people might think is rather cruel, but to live out their life chastely, because those desires cannot be legitimately and morally satisfied. And yet at the same time that a person who has this tendency is in no way diminished as a Christian, and in fact is called to be a believer. And all of us have to discipline sexual desires. As I mentioned before, even in marriage, that doesn't mean that a person has just unlimited their ability to express themselves sexually is limited to their spouse. So they too have to deny themselves, because they cannot have sex with anyone except for their spouse. So everyone has to practice a certain amount of discipline in this area, and so it might be maybe particularly difficult for some, but for that reason, the church is very compassionate. And I think this is one of the things that Pope Francis, I think, has tried to do, is that there have been some things he's been very clear on, but a lot of times I think when it comes to dealing with people, I think he's shown a tremendous amount of patience, perhaps maybe more patience than is warranted in some cases. I don't know. I mean, there's always kind of a judgment call. I think I had mentioned recently in a homily that parents have to balance with their children. Should I be strict or should I be compassionate? And a lot of times you need compassion, but sometimes you also need a certain amount of strictness as well. So it's a very difficult balance to strike all the time. Is there an observation or a question? Was there a question or anything? Okay, I wasn't sure if you had a hand up, so I just, okay, no, that's fine. Yeah. If someone's in the middle of a relationship, are they what? Is the other person a part of the problem, or? I don't know if I entirely understand.
If you have two people in a relationship,
yeah,
and then there's an interloper, as it were.
Okay.
And that person was brought in.
Well, so if for example, I mean, anyone who would act in a way that would encourage a person to sin, that's not helpful. So if you have, for example, a couple that's married and someone else kind of enters into that relationship and perhaps is a source of temptation, I mean, that would not be good. I mean, we want to encourage people to live out their state in life. So you don't want to. So we would want to not do anything that would somehow disrupt a marriage or perhaps do harm to a marriage. On the other hand, when people are dating, I think if they're not yet married, I mean, in theory, a person has not definitively committed themselves to that person. So perhaps they might meet another person. I think, though, a lot of times people would say that's unless the couple breaks up, it's probably considered to be a kind of infidelity to start seeing another person while you're already in a relationship. I think people would say that pretty generally. Am I answering the question at all, or?
Yeah, so it's not a person. I guess everyone can take some sort of blame.
There's an old expression. So the question is who carries the blame? There's an old expression. Let's see. Was this in Syriac, or was this something that Chubby Checker said. I don't remember. It takes two to tango. I think I heard that expression before. No, a lot of times I think when you have, if you have two people and some kind of a romantic relationship develops, I think if you're talking about adults, I think or especially people who would be equals, I think both would have to take some responsibility, because a relationship doesn't happen. It doesn't develop without both parties contributing to it, unless you're talking about something entirely one-sided, like I mentioned rape before. Rape is obviously the blame rests only with the aggressor there. The other thing I should mention as well I shouldn't mention it, but I'm going to say it anyway. And the Catechism doesn't say anything about this, but obviously sexual abuse of a minor would be a grave sin. And in particular, the reason why that becomes so there you would have an unequal sense of responsibility, because you're also no longer talking about equals. So you're talking about someone who would be in a much more powerful position and another person who might be in a very naive position, and so therefore a very weakened position. In that case, now you're very clearly talking about an unequal responsibility. I think it would be very wrong to blame a minor child and say that they were somehow culpable for what happened. That obviously would not be true. So if that kind of helps, and we can ask other questions after if you want as well. So when it comes to the idea of homosexuality, it's not something that we should encourage or give or sanction, I guess, but it's to provide that type of encouragement. But at the same time, for people for whom this would be a difficulty, I think a great amount of patience and compassion is called for. So that's probably the thing to say there. So, okay. With that, and this is not in the Catechism, but again, we almost need to kind of bring this in today, will be the idea of transgenderism, which up until I think the third or fourth edition of the DSM, it's the Diagnostic Statistical Manual that's used by counselors or psychologists. So this would have been something that was referred to as gender dysphoria, or so a person who is uncomfortable or seems to be in conflict with their own gender. So this would have been considered a mental disorder at one time. The APA, Psychiatric Association, American Psychiatric Association, has redefined that, and so there's a lot of politics involved, where that's been stripped out of later editions of the DSM. So this is oftentimes now not seen as a disorder, but something even to be celebrated, and so that's kind of where we've been lately in our society. We would say, now here's one where Pope Francis himself personally, and also the Dicastery for Education in Rome have issued some really very clear and also very wonderful documents. One of them was called Male and Female, He Created Them, and it really talks about the beauty of the fact that we've been created with a gender that has been given to us by God. So a person is a man or a person is a woman, and so this is who we were meant to be. The notion that a person says, well, I feel one way, but on the outside I look a different way. Well, sometimes what's happened is then people have gone through different, even surgical procedures to change what really is the appearance. And you can sort of, I guess today you can do all sorts of things that wouldn't have been even considered or conceivable in the past, but now theoretically you can do all sorts of things now. And so you can make a person now appear to be a different gender. And so oftentimes what I think happens is people say, well, I'm not happy, but I'll be happy if I can make my outsides look like I feel on the inside. And so oftentimes what I think has happened is people have gone through that, and then they found out that they're still not happy. The rate of suicides amongst people with transgenderism or gender dysphoria is extraordinarily high compared to the general population, which is just sociologically an example of that. Okay, so that doesn't solve all of a person's problems. And so I think to say that we've been created by God, we've been beautifully and wonderfully made, to use the Psalm. So it's a phrase out of the scriptures, and that is really very true. And so it's good for us to now people may struggle with how they fit into society, and maybe some people don't feel as masculine as maybe they think they're supposed to be or not supposed to be, or as feminine as they think they're supposed to be or supposed to appear. But this is one where everyone is different. I said, okay, I feel like I'm giving you all the pep talk here. Everyone's different, and we also need to kind of be at peace, I think, with who we are. And to be unhappy about who a person is itself just not very healthy. So we just want to encourage people to, in fact, to appreciate what they've been given and who they are, to appreciate that for what it is. I think is really important. So the Catechism does not go into this, because this is somewhat new, but I think it's an important thing to also respect. So from here, then we go into marriage itself. So sexual intercourse, or the marital act, this is something that unites husband and wife physically. So when we say that the two have become one, we actually do even mean in a physical sense that they become one flesh. And so this happens when they are united in that most intimate way. This is something that a lot of times I think maybe sometimes people think about sex as something that's kind of a taboo topic or something that's dirty, but the Catechism mentions, and this is one of those true statements, that it is something that is a source of joy and pleasure, and is something that is honorable. It is something that brings together a husband and wife, and so it's meant, in fact, to draw a husband and wife together more and more in their union. And it also brings with it the potential blessing of procreation. So when children can be brought into the marriage. Sometimes I think in our society, children are looked at as a threat, like a disease, or at least a lot of times people say, well, I want to enjoy the sexual pleasure, but without having the risk or the danger of having a child, especially if people are having sex but who are not married. Then oftentimes, well, they don't want to have the child. So there's a tendency sometimes in our society to want to separate those two, as if we can have the one without the other. That is really very difficult to do. And this is where one of the things that's mentioned under this section is the importance of fecundity, which just means fruitfulness. So the idea that we are open to life. So one of the things that oftentimes people will look for are ways to prevent conception, so contraception, and all of these come with some kind of a downside or some sort of a negative consequence. And so this is one of these things where, and if you're really candid with people who are going through this kind of thought process or these questions, there's always, you have to kind of think through the full consequences that are there, because there's there can always be some sort of drawback or negativity. Either sometimes methods of contraception are not 100% perfect or 100% effective. Sometimes there are other things that can go along with that, or other difficulties. So, I won't get more graphic into all of those things, but just a lot of times I think when people look at that, I remember, and I tell this to couples that are preparing for marriage a lot of times, I can remember when I was growing up, so this would be in the 70s, and I remember television shows where sometimes the plot line would involve the teenage daughter announcing to her father, "I'm going on the pill," and so they say, "Well, what do you think about that, Dad?" And so, because at the time it was kind of one of these things that the pill was thought to be now the solution to all of life's problems. Okay, so now all problems will be solved. So now we can have consequence-free sexual expression. So nothing will go wrong. Okay. Oh yeah. Okay. That's how it worked out. Yes. Okay. No, that's not how it worked out. Paul VI issued a document called Humanae Vitae in 1968. It's kind of the famous document in which Pope Paul VI spoke about the idea of contraception being morally evil. And he was very much lambasted for that at the time. It was a document that was rejected by many people, even by many priests and theologians even at the time. But I think he was really very prescient, because he warned about some of the things. He says, if you go down this path, there are going to be consequences. And he talked about, women are going to be devalued. They're going to be seen increasingly as just sexual objects, and you're going to have more divorce, and you're going to have more. And he warned about all these things, all of which happened. Everything that he warned people about, they all happened. And now when I talk with couples, and as they're preparing for marriage, even. There's kind of that notion, like I think people are really conscious of what they put into their body. So the notion of like taking hormones to regulate their cycle. So it's like, okay, well, now there are side effects here too. And that's just one example where I think people are maybe a little bit more cautious now, and a little bit more aware that maybe this wasn't so perfect the way that we were told at first. So in the 1970s, when those television programs were on, I didn't entirely understand what I was, but I remember some of these different episodes. I'm like, well, so I wasn't old enough to entirely understand what was going on, but I remember some of these things. That was the societal thing at the time. When it comes then to the idea of having children, so when couples marry, one of the things that they do have to promise is that they are open to life, so that they're open to having children. It does not mean that a couple has to have the maximum number of children possible. So they need not have as many children as possible. Large families are a great blessing, and in times past, especially when infant mortality was higher, people sometimes, people might not always survive into adulthood, and so having a larger family was perhaps a little bit more of a normal thing, and certainly helped to support the family a lot of times, and that actually is a beautiful thing. But there is also a thing called natural family planning, which is mentioned. It's mentioned also in Humanae Vitae, and it's the notion that the way that the human body is made is that a woman is not fertile 100% of the time, but that in the course of a woman's ordinary cycle, there's a fertile period that happens around ovulation, and then outside of that window, there's an infertile time. And so the concept, and that's as scientific as I'm going to get today for this purpose, but the concept there is that it's possible to, especially with what we know today, to abstain from sexual intercourse during that fertile window, and then to have sexual intercourse outside of the fertile window, and that is a legitimate way for couples that would like to try to space or to regulate the number of births, a way to do that. The idea of trying to overcome sterility, some people have a difficult time with that, where they have difficulty conceiving. Some people have used natural family planning to try to find out when the fertile time is to have the best chance of success. That actually has sometimes been helpful. I know one couple in particular who were successful in conceiving because they were able to use that scientific knowledge to help overcome that barrier. However, one of the things about in vitro fertilization is that separates the sexual act from the procreative act, and so that actually in vitro fertilization is not permissible morally in the church. I think now on a surface level, I think a lot of times people would say, well, the church is pro-life, that we encourage people to have children, so this is a way of helping them have children. What's wrong with helping a couple that might have challenges of sterility, about helping them overcome that? And the difficulty, I think, sometimes gets into the practical details. And I've dealt with this before. I think I may have even used this example in a previous OCIA class, where I mentioned that, so I knew someone who had a certain number of children, essentially in the test tube or in the laboratory, and so they knew that they had a certain number of embryos, and so sometimes then as you then try to implant the embryo, sometimes you have to have more than one because you want a chance of success, and so sometimes so it's all manipulating life. It's a little bit kind of draconian it's kind of creepy when you start thinking about us kind of playing Frankenstein a little bit, about we're gonna create life and we're gonna decide what to do with it. And sometimes was there someone, what was the name? I don't remember the name of the person, but wasn't there someone called an Octomom? Octomom, yes, exactly. Okay. So all of a sudden, you may not have said, well, we just hope that maybe one of these takes, and then if you end up having 6 children at one time or 8, so that's one side of that. Another side is what if you have you've been successful, and so you've had children, and what if you have additional embryos that are cryogenically frozen? Now what do you do with them? When you stop to think about it, I think sometimes people kind of may think on one level, they say, okay, well, it's just an embryo. I mean, that might be someone's thinking, until they start having other children and they realize, well, there's one of that was just an embryo until that child was born, and then that child and that child. And so these are actually real. Once you get to know them, now all of a sudden you realize, oh, that's a real person. And so now what about the embryos that are unused? And now all of a sudden we have a really serious moral problem. So what do you do with that? That's one of the, sometimes I think people don't think through all of these things. And if we were to think through them, I think we'd realize that there's maybe a little bit more trouble there than maybe we at first thought. But children are a gift from God, so the idea of accepting children from God is an important part of marriage. Other sins then that would be against marriage, so misuses of sexuality that would be against marriage, would be adultery, obviously. So adultery, that's the very thing that's mentioned expressly in the sixth commandment, is thou shalt not commit adultery. So that would be sexual activity between a married person and someone who's not their spouse. Even the idea of divorce. Divorce is actually a sin against the dignity of marriage. It's what God has joined together, man must not separate. However, there's lots of divorce in the world. There can be a time completely legitimately when there may be troubles in a marriage and spouses may have to separate, hopefully just for a time. And that actually can be legitimate, and that's mentioned in the Catechism. But in particular, to permanently separate a marriage that is intended to be till death do we part is a sin against marriage. However, okay, this is where now we have to then put on that pastoral perspective, is to realize that sometimes you can have extremely difficult situations, especially ones in which perhaps some of the parties in the marriage are really not safe. And so there are times when I think for the safety and protection of children, if they are at risk, or the safety and the protection of a spouse, if one of the spouses is actually in real danger, there might be times when divorce can be tolerated, and perhaps when in fact the idea of separating from that spouse is really in fact prudent and is to be encouraged, but those would be serious cases. When it comes to divorce, not all parties are necessarily equally culpable. So you might have, the marriage may fall apart because of the actions predominantly of one of the parties, and you might refer to the other party as kind of the innocent spouse. So it's a very complicated thing, and it's a reality we deal with, unfortunately, in our society. We do not encourage divorce, but sometimes it happens, and sometimes it happens for reasons that where it actually can be tolerated because of the severe difficulty. Other sins against the sixth commandment: polygamy, polyandry. So to have more than one spouse. So 3-4 people. Okay, no. That's not pretty. Incest would be another example. The idea of a free union, meaning we're just together, so without the benefit of marriage, but we're partners, but we're not actually married. Or even the idea of a trial marriage. A trial marriage is what the Catechism means by that, is the idea that people are going to sort of like give it a try. We're going to practice. Anytime couples are cohabiting, and I go through this when preparing couples for marriage, no one ever believes this, but the statistics are pretty clear that couples who cohabit before they're married have a higher divorce rate. And I know everyone always is kind of shocked by that, like, well, no, but they wanted to see if they were compatible, so isn't that going to help them be more successful? And the answer is no. Oddly enough, it doesn't work that way. But the idea of a practice relationship before marriage, that actually is not. So no, that would not be permitted under the sixth commandment. Okay, so there's the sixth commandment. I didn't intend to speak this long on what we've already done. So questions before I move on to the seventh commandment. There, we kind of asked a few questions along the way, but that's yeah.
When you say a couple who's cohabited, and then they get married, and they say, well, it's like we were already married before, so nothing's changed after they get married.
So what would I say about a couple is cohabiting, then they get married, and then after the marriage, it doesn't seem like anything's changed. One of the things I would say there is that what marriage is supposed to be is something that is really a wonderful celebration, because now there's something new. If the couple's cohabiting, then they marry, and then there's nothing that may seem new. So that newness that would come normally with the marriage is not present. And I think that might be maybe one of the best reasons to say, no, there's actually something to be said about saving oneself for marriage, and that their joy once they are married can actually be all that greater. If they basically have been living as though they were married, then the only thing that comes with the marriage now is an obligation. I guess now we're locked in, so because we had all of the other fruits in anticipation or early. So I guess that's maybe what I'd say about that. Okay. So the seventh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
If a person is gay or lesbian, is that a decision by heredity or choice?
So if a person is gay or lesbian, is that by heredity or choice? We really don't know, and the Catechism actually is specific in not trying to confront that. It says there are a multiplicity of factors, and it even, I think, even says that the consensus is not entirely clear on that question. So, is it by heredity? I don't know about heredity. There's always that question about nature versus nurture. Is it something that is it something that's in a person's nature that they're disposed to, or is it the environment in which they're raised? We really don't know. Are there sometimes people will point to psychological factors. Maybe someone didn't have a good experience with their father or their mother when they grew up, and so it kind of affected them and stunted their sexual development or their sexual maturity. I don't know. I mean, I'm not going to take a stand on that because it's such a complex issue, and I don't know that there's an answer to that. Is it the fluoride in the water? Is there theories about that too? I don't know. So I'll just kind of leave all that aside. I don't really know how to answer that question. So maybe someday we'll find out. I don't know. So right now I don't think we know. So the seventh commandment, so thou shalt not steal. So in this commandment, we really have a respect for people's property. And so the idea of that a person would have their own belongings and their own property. This belongs to me. We can also say that sometimes occurs because it's the fruit of a person's labor. So we say, so I've labored, and so I've either made this, which is mine, or I've labored and bought something. I've earned money and bought something, so this is mine. So the notion that it would be wrong to deprive someone of something that belongs to them, that's really what's underneath the seventh commandment. But here's a problem, though. So to whom did everything belong when the world was first made? And so the Catechism goes back to the beginning, to the idea of a common or a shared stewardship. That in the beginning, Adam and Eve, so did they say, well, this is my possession, so you can't have it? Well, everything in the garden was given to Adam and Eve for them to enjoy. So and there was really no shortage of blessings or fruits available to them. So you don't need to worry about private property if you have everything. So if you share that in common. So so that was how we were created in the beginning. So you might say we were with the sense of common stewardship, or the universal destination of the created world. Those are some of the expressions used in the Catechism. What's going to happen in heaven? So will we have private property in heaven? So this is mine, you can't have it. Okay, no, in heaven, there's no private property in heaven. So oddly enough, we're kind of living in a phase in which you have private property, but it wasn't created that way in the beginning, and it will not be that way in eternity. Also, there's an interesting expression in the Acts of the Apostles that when the early Christian community first developed, when they first came together, it says they gathered around the apostles and they shared all things in common. There was already a little bit of a kind of like an image of this sort of like ideal Christian community that was beginning to form in Acts chapter 2. So it's an interesting expression. We don't have the sisters with us tonight, but anytime you see a religious order, they take a vow of poverty because their community, so their possessions are not held personally, but you say that the community actually owns all of their property. And so there is another example of not emphasizing private property so much. However, in the world in which we live now, it turns out that we actually do have private property. We do have things that we need. And so because of the things that we possess, and especially the things that we depend on, so that that are the fruit of our labor, it is important that a person's property actually be respected. So it is wrong for us to take what does not belong to us. At the same time, now I'm going to go back to that notion of like the ideal situation in theory, like the way it was made in the beginning. Catechism also reminds us that even though we possess our own possessions, we must be mindful of the needs of charity, the needs of others. And so for a person to possess and for another person to need, And for a person then to just simply be insensitive to that need, that in fact is not just as well. So the idea of private property is not so exalted that it becomes itself a supreme good. No, there's another good, the law of charity or the law of justice, that even supersedes that. So the notion that we are mindful of the needs of others is important. Some of the goods of production, this is something the Catechism mentions, are actually intended to be for public use, or need to be mindful of a society itself. So for example, let's say that you had one person who possessed or who owned land. Well, land to some extent is, and there's a certain amount of land, and it's not like a person made the land. I mean, the land was there, and you may have bought the land, but the land is kind of like a naturally occurring thing. Or for example, you might say the goods that are present, like what do you call natural things that are present that can be extracted from the earth or things like that. The Catechism says that when it comes to these goods of production, it is morally responsible to make sure that those objects are used in a way that does benefit the largest number of people possible. So for a person, for example, to possess, say someone's rich enough to buy up all of this land and then they're just going to sit on it and not do anything with it. Well, that's not right. I mean, the land should be put to productive use. So just because a person owns it, say, I can do what I want with my property. In general, yes, but we also have a responsibility to a community. So owning property does not excuse a person from their responsibilities toward the other members of a society. And civil authority does have the right to regulate some of these things, and so there is a role to be played by governments to make sure that, especially the goods of production and the way in which property is managed is in fact used well. It's one of the reasons why we also tax people, and so some person has earned more, so they are taxed more. That is not necessarily, it may feel unjust. Is it April 15th yet? Not quite? Okay, not quite yet. It may feel unjust, but in fact, that is something that is reasonable because it is an expression of the way in which we're mindful of the needs of others. Now, I will leave entirely aside the question as to whether or not the government is an efficient user of your tax dollars. I leave that entirely to your discussion there. But the notion that in fact it's something that can be regulated by government is in fact not untrue. That is a true statement. That is reasonable. One of the things that we should be mindful of then with respect to our own property is the idea of temperance. Temperance is the idea we moderate our attachment to physical things or to goods or to the world's goods. And so this actually is a virtue for us to develop. So sometimes our consumeristic society, if it just says, well, just accumulate, get more and more and more and more, well, that actually, that could be very short-sighted. You might remember there was a gospel parable where the person had so many possessions, he had so many good things, he says, I will have to tear down my bins and build bigger bins to hold all of my things. So now I can sit back and take life easy because I have goods stored up for many, many years. And then God says to that man, you fool, tonight your life will be asked of you. To whom will these things go? Because all of our possessions, this is another thing about our life in this world, is we gained them, we came into the world with nothing, and we're going to go out of the world with nothing. So all of them will get left behind somewhere. So that's just a good perspective to hold on to. Justice is a virtue that requires us to render unto others what is their due. And especially when we have people who are in need, and we think about especially those afflicted with great poverty or those who suffer, we owe them out of the law of love, and we owe them in justice. In the virtue of justice, we owe them assistance. And so this is one of the things that is brought up in the Catechism, and I think it's very good to bring this up. So I know we said don't take from someone else, but I've spent all this time talking about our duties toward other people. And it's an important thing to take into mind. So sins against the seventh commandment would then obviously be the idea of theft. This may be compromised in cases of urgent necessity. There are times at which if a person is on the brink of death or something, that they may have need of something, this could be taken to extreme in some communities where there's been excessive looting. They'd say, oh, I need more stuff. That's no. Okay, so that's not to condone looting, but if it's a question of a dire and a severe circumstance, it may not be sinful if a person is actually taking something simply because they have to sustain life. That it's a situation that is so severe. Also against the seventh commandment would be unjustly retaining something that's not your own. So may I borrow that? And then I borrow something from someone and refuse to return it. So to not return what is borrowed would be the seventh commandment. If we borrow something or take something from someone and we don't return it and we're careless with it such that we lose it, and so that would be carelessness with another's goods. That also would be against the seventh commandment. Other things against the seventh commandment would include fraud. So to deliberately defraud someone, that is a way of stealing from them functionally. So they should have read the contract. No. If you were actually up to no good and were taking advantage of another person, and especially if it was illegal, that fraud would be stealing. Paying someone unjust wages, so to not pay someone a living wage or a wage that would be appropriate for their for the services that are there, that would be stealing a person's labor, for example. Price manipulation, so I know this is one of the things whenever things happen, they say, oh, we're going to prevent price gouging. Well, if a person is, for example, taking advantage of markets or in a way that they're going to try to profit from something, whenever you have winners, you also have losers oftentimes when it comes to the market, for example. So even that manipulation by which a person might grow rich may in fact be, especially if it's taking advantage of something. A person has inside knowledge of something that's going to happen. So they make themselves rich. Well, someone's going to lose money on that deal. So it's coming from somewhere. So that would be stealing. Breaking a contract. So if you promised that you would do something and then you failed to do that, you've now stolen from them what you promised you would give them or pay them or do for them. So breaking a contract or breaking a promise, it's part of commutative justice that we want to hold people to their words. So if you said you were going to do something, to fail to do that would be against the seventh commandment. Failing to make restitution. So if you've harmed someone, then you owe it to provide to repair the damage that was done. To not do that would be against the seventh commandment. Also, the Catechism mentions games of chance. If a person was gambling something and it was putting their livelihood at risk, or serious gambling, or something that was going to impoverish someone, this is now stealing from what might in fact be owed to that person's spouse or children. If they're engaged so much in gambling that it could actually put other people in harm, then you could actually run into that. Gambling itself does not automatically constitute a sin, but if it's excessive, there's a danger there. Enslaving a person, you're stealing their liberty. So that would be, so just to kind of go through all these things. When it comes to creation, there are things that we can say are commonly shared by all, so we all benefit from the creative world around us. We should be good stewards, and so there you have like our proper stewardship over animals and plants, natural resources. It would be unjust, for example, so to own, so is it wrong to have pets or to use animals or to eat animals, for example? Okay, there's nothing wrong with that, but it would be unjust to cause unnecessary suffering to animals. So that's just to kind of play all of these things out. That's mentioned under the seventh commandment. Social justice is oftentimes, it has to do with the church's teaching in economic and in social matters. And so when it comes to social justice, fundamentally the church's concern is that we show concern for one another, that we respect our obligations toward one another, which I kind of talked about already. The church, however, rejects communism and socialism, so a lot of times these are rooted in atheistic theology or ideologies. But also the notion of communism and socialism is to say that all things belong to the state, and that would be fundamentally what Marx and what Lenin had in mind would have been the total denial of private property, and that's wrong. So the notion that we in fact can possess private property runs against communism or socialism, and the church rejects that. The church rejects totalitarianism, in which then an all-powerful state just simply then dominates or dictates the lives of people under them. But at the same time, the church also rejects pure capitalism. Capitalism would be that notion like the only thing that matters is capital or money. So let people be as free as possible to make as much money as they want. The danger there is that this, meaning irrespective of any harm that might be done to people. So putting property above people, putting things above people in a purely capitalistic system would also be rejected. Now, I oftentimes respond to that what we have in this country is not a purely capitalistic system. So we talk about oftentimes our country as being capitalistic or practicing capitalism, but I think anyone who's tried to found a business knows that we are not in a totally free market. So there are plenty of regulations that we encounter a lot around us. So we very much have a lot of freedom, but in a regulated system. And regulations that are imposed by government are reasonable, or it is reasonable for government to impose regulations for the protection of individuals. Now again, I leave it to you to decide whether or not all the regulations present in our country today are, in fact, ideal and in the common good. I'll let you make that conclusion. But that there should be some regulation is actually perfectly true, especially for the sake of protecting people. It is not good to multiply goods merely for the sake of profit. So a person is just simply storing up just for the purpose of trying to accumulate as much as possible. That is in fact not a good thing. One of the things that marks people who are wealthy, however, and this is, I think, what did the Lord say about the rich? He says how hard it is for the rich to enter the kingdom of God, right? So because of their attachment to their things. One of the great redeeming factors for people who have been very blessed and who are very wealthy is that they also be very generous. And so generosity becomes a great remedy for that. So blessed is the person who has been given much, but then also who gives much. And so that generosity is, I think, part of how those who have wealth, in fact, will be saved, is by detaching themselves from that, especially through generosity, through charitable giving. We work is a duty, work is a way of actualizing our potential, using our talents. So in fact, it is good that we work. We celebrate St. Joseph, for example, as a model of worker, Joseph the worker. So here's someone who labored with his hands, and that is a good thing. So in fact, it's a part of our own creativity that we in fact want to make something, we want to fashion things or to improve the world. We are meant to do this. And so it is also something that Jesus did, not only as a carpenter, but we can say he engaged in the work of redemption. So even Jesus's work, you might say, okay, now he wasn't fashioning something when he was preaching in his public ministry, but that was work, and that was work that was taking place to complete our redemption. And so it is important that each person have the right to undertake initiatives that they wish to do, so that a person in fact should be able to work and then to seek a standard of living. That is an important thing to protect, and in fact the civil authorities, so the state or the government, in fact should protect and safeguard an individual person's right to engage in labor to support themselves. Things that would be sins against this social justice, or that would also then fall under the idea of stealing. Stealing opportunities from people, for example, through discrimination. Discrimination would be unjust. That would be a sin. Paying an unjust wage, and also not contributing to those social programs of support that we may be required to support. So that and that's part of where taxation comes in. So we are paying essentially also for what sometimes you call the safety net. But the notion that we have a responsibility of supporting our society, supporting those other people in our society, that is important as well. Even amongst nations, the idea that one nation to another nation, if one nation has been greatly blessed, it is also the responsibility of those who have to be mindful of the needs of other nations as well. So the idea of inequality among nations is in fact to be discouraged, and conflicts that prevent nations from working together should be overcome. One of the responsibilities of lay people is to order the world, to order the temporal world, to make it conform more to the common good or more to the ideal. And so this is something that really, it's not really for pastors or bishops or whatnot to decide these things. This is actually a lay vocation. So this is what lay people rightly do, is they work to improve the world. So they serve in ways in order to solve the problems that exist in our world today, and it is good that we try to do that. One of the things that we conclude the seventh commandment talking about is the poor. We know that Jesus loved the poor, and so God is close, especially the poor. He looks after the poor. It is wrong, in fact, to take advantage or to deprive the poor. And the prophets constantly warn people about the way that they would treat those who are poor. So the notion that we should love the poor and even love poverty, be detached from things, that oftentimes maybe we're better off when we're poor rather than when we're rich. The corporal works of mercy are all about caring for the poor. So feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, giving drink to the thirsty. All of these are ways of helping the poor. And something that comes up in the scriptures when we talk about forgiveness, and oftentimes forgiveness is one of those things that is encouraged. Even the idea of forgiving debts. There are some parables where we hear about the parable in which a person's debts are forgiven, and it's a sign of great mercy, and I think it's something we're encouraged to do. So we kind of finish this seventh commandment with this observation about poverty, which is actually a good thing for us to think about, a good thing for us to be mindful of. So those are things on the seventh commandment. Questions or observations about that? Seventh commandment is just not as interesting as the sixth commandment. Boy, that sixth commandment is just a lot more interesting, isn't it? So, tell me more about social justice. No, you don't want to hear more about that. So, anyway, those would be important factors for the seventh commandment. So next time we'll continue on with the eighth commandment, and then ninth and 10th are both covet, thou shalt not covet, and those will go fairly quickly. So we're going to pretty much, I think, wrap up the 10 commandments next time. So that'll be our plan. And glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Okay, very good. Thanks.